Think about this for a second. Right now, if someone steals your wallet, logs into your bank account, and takes out a massive loan in your name, you know exactly what to call it. It is identity theft. It is a federal crime. You call the police, you freeze your credit, and you start the long, painful process of proving that you are, in fact, you. We take this concept entirely for granted. We assume that our identity, our name, our social security number, our credit history, is recognized by the law as our personal property, like the house we live in or the car we drive. But here is a fact that might genuinely disturb you. For the vast majority of American history, your identity did not legally belong to you. If someone stole your entire life in 1985, if they opened credit cards in your name, bought a car, drained your savings, and racked up $50,000 in debt, they had not committed a federal crime against you. Not legally, because until the year 1998, the United States of America had absolutely no federal laws against identity theft. None. Zero. The concept simply did not exist in the American legal code. So, if there were no laws protecting who you were, how did anyone keep their life secure? And what happened when a total stranger decided to simply become you? The answer is darker, stranger, and far more infuriating than you might imagine. Because before 1998, when a thief stole your identity, the law did not consider you the victim. According to the United States government and the banking system, the only true victim was the bank or the credit card company that lost the money. You were just collateral damage. You were left entirely on your own to fight off aggressive debt collectors and clear your name in a legal system that literally had no definition for what had just happened to you. How did the most advanced economy on Earth function for over 2 centuries without ever criminalizing the theft of a person's existence? And what exactly forced the federal government to finally wake up in 1998 and rewrite the rules of reality? To understand how we went from a system built entirely on blind trust to the digital fortress we have today, we have to go back to a time when stealing a life was shockingly easy. Because the story of identity in America is not really a story about security. It is a story about corporate convenience, unintended consequences, and the terrifying realization that for generations, anyone could become anyone else, and the law would simply look the other way. Let me take you back to a time before passwords, before biometrics, and before the internet, to see how incredibly fragile your existence actually was. For most of the 20th century, your identity wasn't a digital footprint. It was a physical object, a piece of paper, a birth certificate tucked in a drawer, a driver's license in a wallet. Before the internet, before interconnected databases and biometric scanners, America ran on a concept that seems almost hilariously naive today. The honor system. If you walked into a bank, a car dealership, or a government office and presented a piece of paper with a name on it, the person behind the counter looked at the paper, looked at you, and just assumed you were telling the truth. Because here is the fatal flaw with paper. Paper is blind. It has absolutely no idea who is actually holding it. Criminals understood this perfectly. They realized that in an analog world, reality wasn't what was actually true. Reality was whatever the paperwork said. And this massive, gaping loophole gave rise to one of the most chilling and effective methods of identity theft in American history. Law enforcement called it the graveyard trick. Imagine it is 1975. A thief needs to disappear. They need a completely clean slate, a new name, a non-existent credit history. Where do they go? They don't go to a hacker. They don't go to the dark web. They go to a local cemetery. The thief would walk through the quiet rows of tombstones, scanning the dates until they found a specific kind of grave. They were looking for an infant. A baby who had been born around the exact same year as the thief, but who had tragically died just a few days or months later. The thief would write down the baby's full name and date of birth. Then, they would simply walk down to the local county clerk's office, fill out a basic form, and request a duplicate birth certificate for that exact name. Now, logically, the clerk should have seen that this person was deceased. But in the 1970s and 1980s, local death records were almost never cross-referenced with birth records. The filing systems were entirely separate. The clerk would go to a dusty cabinet, pull the birth record, stamp an official seal on it, and hand the thief a brand new life, all for a processing fee of about $5. With that single, authentic piece of paper, the illusion was complete. The thief could take that birth certificate to the DMV and get a driver's license. With the license, they could open a bank account. With the bank account, they could get loans, rent an apartment, and build an entire fraudulent existence. The baby in the graveyard remained buried. But on paper? On paper, they had grown up. For decades, this was the ultimate ghost trick. It was terrifyingly simple, practically undetectable, and completely untethered from federal identity theft laws because, again, those laws didn't exist. But as America's economy boomed, paper was no longer enough. The financial system was expanding, and corporations needed a way to track people faster and across state lines. They needed a universal identifier. And that is exactly when the government made one of the most catastrophic administrative mistakes in modern history. In 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. It was a massive program designed to keep elderly Americans out of poverty. But immediately, the government faced a monumental logistical nightmare. How on earth do you track the wages of tens of millions of workers over the course of their entire lives? The solution was a simple 9-digit code, the Social Security number. But here is the detail that history has almost completely forgotten. When the government introduced this number in 1936, the American public was terrified. People were deeply suspicious of a centralized tracking system. They looked at the national ID cards being used by authoritarian regimes in Europe and wanted absolutely no part of it. So, to calm the public, the federal government made a solemn, ironclad promise. They swore that this 9-digit number would only be used to track retirement accounts. It would never, ever be used as a national identification number. In fact, if you look at early Social Security cards, you will see a phrase printed right on the bottom in bold, capital letters, "Not for identification." It was a promise. And for a little while, the government actually kept it. But then, the American economy fundamentally changed. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s arrived. Consumer credit exploded. Suddenly, everyone wanted to buy cars, televisions, and suburban homes on installment plans. Banks and credit bureaus faced an impossible problem. With millions of people named John Smith or Mary Johnson moving constantly from state to state, how could a bank tell who was a reliable borrower and who was a deadbeat? Paper records were too messy. They desperately needed a unique, universal identifier for every single citizen. And sitting right there, tucked inside almost every American wallet, was a 9-digit number. The federal government did not mandate this change. Congress did not pass a law turning the Social Security number into a national ID. Corporate America simply hijacked it. Businesses started asking for it. If you wanted a credit card, you had to write down the number. If you wanted a mortgage, you handed over the number. If you wanted to open a bank account, they needed the number. Slowly, quietly, and entirely by accident, the Social Security number became the master key to your entire life. And that was a catastrophic problem. Because this 9-digit code was never designed with security in mind. It had no password. It had no encryption. It had no biometrics. It was just 9 raw numbers. If a criminal learned those 9 numbers, they did not just know who you were. In the eyes of the financial system, they literally became you. By the 1970s and 1980s, something massive was shifting behind the scenes of the American economy. We were moving from the era of paper files into the era of mainframe computers. Suddenly, it wasn't just your local bank holding your information. A new kind of invisible empire was rising, the credit bureaus. Companies like Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion began hoovering up every piece of financial data they could find on every single American. But to make these massive digital databases work, these corporations needed a way to link your mortgage, your car loan, and your credit cards together. The Social Security number was the perfect glue. Without asking for your permission, without passing a federal privacy law, corporate America silently hardwired your 9-digit number into the foundation of the modern financial system. This was a brilliant move for corporate efficiency. It allowed banks to approve loans in minutes, but it created a terrifying new reality for ordinary citizens. Think about how absurd this system actually was. Your Social Security number functioned as both your public username and your secret password at the exact same time. You had to write this number on job applications, doctor's forms, school registrations, and tax documents. It was everywhere. It was practically public. Yet, if a stranger recited those exact same 9 digits to a bank over the telephone, the bank treated it as absolute proof of your identity. It was the equivalent of leaving the key to your house taped to your front door, and the banking system acting shocked every time someone walked inside. This corporate hijacking created a golden opportunity for a new breed of criminal. You no longer needed to wander through dusty graveyards looking for deceased infants. You didn't even need to be in the same state as your victim. All you needed was a name, a 9-digit number, and a telephone. Criminals started dumpster diving behind corporate offices. They bribed low-level employees at car dealerships and medical clinics to hand over lists of social security numbers. It was a flawless crime, with absolutely no legal consequences. Once a thief had your number, they would call a bank, claim they had moved, and change the address on your profile. Then, they would request a new credit card. The card went directly to the thief's address. The thief maxed it out, bought expensive electronics and vacations, and then completely vanished into thin air. And the most infuriating part? When the bank realized the money was gone, they didn't go looking for the thief. They came looking for you. Because in this newly digital reality, the computer database said you owed the money. And in the 1980s, the computer was simply never, ever wrong. Imagine answering your home phone in 1988. A furious debt collector is on the other end, demanding $20,000 for a sports car you never bought in a state you have never visited. You panic. You tell them there has been a massive mistake. You drive down to your local police station to report a crime. But when you stand in front of the police officer and explain that someone stole your identity, the officer just stares at you with a blank expression. Why? Because as far as the law was concerned, no crime had been committed against you. If a thief stole your television, that was a crime. If they stole your physical wallet, that was a crime. But if they stole your 9-digit number and used it to trick a bank out of $20,000? The law looked at that scenario and said, well, the bank lost the money. The bank is the victim of fraud. You did not lose any money. Therefore, you are not a victim, unquote. It was a bizarre, twisted legal loophole. Identity theft was legally classified as bank fraud. This left ordinary Americans trapped in an absolute nightmare. The police refused to take a report because, technically, you were not the injured party. But the banks and credit bureaus absolutely treated you like the suspect. Since the bank lost the money, they wanted someone to pay, and your name was on the account. Victims spent years of their lives fighting invisible enemies. They were denied mortgages. They were rejected for jobs. They had their wages illegally garnished. To clear your name in the 1980s, you had to hire expensive lawyers, track down fraudulent receipts, and basically act as a private detective for your own life. And even if you finally convinced one bank that you were innocent, the credit bureaus were incredibly slow to fix their massive databases. The black mark stayed on your financial record for years. You were forced to live as a second-class citizen, financially paralyzed, simply because corporate America had weaponized your social security number without your permission. The devastation was entirely real, but the law treated it as an illusion. The system was utterly broken, and it was going to take one specific high-profile disaster to finally force the United States government to realize that stealing a life was actually a crime. Let me tell you a story that perfectly captures the pure insanity of this era. In the early 1990s, a criminal managed to get his hands on the social security number of a completely innocent, hardworking man. What this criminal did next was not just a crime, it was a total takeover. The thief did not just open a single credit card. He essentially cloned the victim. He used the 9-digit number to buy luxury cars, motorcycles, and expensive jewelry. He took out massive personal loans. He even bought a luxury house. For years, the criminal lived like a king, using a name and a number that did not belong to him. And when the debt finally became too massive to handle, the thief did the unthinkable. He walked into a courthouse and legally filed for bankruptcy under the victim's name. Meanwhile, the real victim had absolutely no idea this secret parallel life even existed. He only found out when he went to his local bank to apply for a standard mortgage. The bank manager looked at him with disgust and denied the loan, explaining that his credit file showed a massive, catastrophic bankruptcy. The victim's life completely unraveled. He was denied jobs. His credit was destroyed. He spent thousands of dollars and countless hours trying to prove that he was not the man who bought those cars or filed for that bankruptcy. Eventually, the criminal was caught. But here is the part that will make your blood boil. When the thief stood in front of a judge, he was charged with making false statements to a bank. He was charged with defrauding financial institutions. But for stealing a man's name? For completely destroying an innocent citizen's reputation and causing him years of psychological and financial torture? The criminal faced absolutely zero charges. Under the law, ruining a person's life was not a punishable offense. The judge literally had no statute to use to punish the thief for identity theft. The thief served a light sentence for bank fraud, while the victim spent the next decade desperately trying to piece his shattered reality back together. This was absolutely not an isolated incident. By the mid-1990s, this exact nightmare was happening to tens of thousands of Americans every single year. The public outrage was finally reaching a boiling point. The government could no longer pretend that the broken system was working. By 1998, the United States was standing on the edge of a massive technological cliff. The internet was rapidly taking over the world. Suddenly, criminals did not need to dig through physical trash cans or bribe local clerks to steal your 9-digit number. They could steal thousands of identities with a few keystrokes. The scale of the crisis exploded. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were suddenly finding their lives hijacked. And finally, the politicians in Washington could no longer ignore the fire burning in their own backyard. The public anger was simply too loud, echoing across the entire country and demanding immediate action. On October 30th, 1998, Congress passed a piece of legislation that permanently altered the American legal system. It was called the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. When President Bill Clinton signed this bill into law, it did something that seems incredibly basic, but was actually deeply revolutionary. For the very first time in American history, the federal government officially declared that stealing a person's identity was a federal crime. The law explicitly stated that the actual human being whose name was stolen was legally considered a victim. They were no longer treated as invisible collateral damage in a bank fraud case. You, the citizen, finally had the right to seek justice. This legislation changed everything. It made identity theft punishable by up to 15 years in federal prison. It gave law enforcement agencies, like the FBI and the Secret Service, the authority to actively hunt down identity thieves. And most importantly, it required the Federal Trade Commission to set up a central database where victims could actually report the crime and get official help to restore their shattered credit. After more than 2 centuries of existing on a blind honor system and decades of corporate negligence, your identity was finally recognized as your own personal property. The government had finally built a wall to protect you. It felt like a massive, permanent victory. Everyone breathed a heavy sigh of relief, believing that the nightmare was finally over. The laws were strictly in place. The federal agents were finally on active patrol. But there was just one terrifying problem that nobody in 1998 fully understood yet. The government had just built a massive wall to protect your paper identity. But your identity was no longer on paper. It was rapidly moving into the dark, vulnerable digital cloud. We celebrate the 1998 law as a victory. But let us ask a terrifying question. Is your identity actually safer today than it was in 1985? The brutal truth is, no, it is not. Today, identity theft is highly illegal, but it is also easier and more common than ever before. We no longer have criminals sneaking into graveyards to steal a single name. Instead, we have massive, faceless data breaches. We have the Equifax hack of 2017, where the personal details of 147 million Americans were stolen in an instant. Modern hackers do not even need to call a bank and pretend to be you. They just buy your entire life on the dark web for a few dollars. And here is the ultimate tragic irony of this entire story. Despite all the new laws, despite the modern encryption, and despite the endless security checks, the entire American financial system is still balancing on top of that exact same 9-digit number created in 1936. The government never actually fixed the root problem. They just put a legal band-aid on a fundamentally broken architecture. Corporate America still relies on a number that was explicitly designed to never be an identification card. So yes, today, if a dangerous criminal steals your entire life, the law finally recognizes you as a legitimate victim. You can file a police report. You can freeze your credit. But the exhausting, terrifying burden of protecting your existence still falls entirely on your shoulders. The invisible threat is still there, waiting in the digital shadows. If this story changed the way you think about your identity, about your privacy, or about the massive corporate systems that quietly control your life, I would appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. We go deep on these kinds of hidden power structures, the ones that shape your world in ways most people never think about. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, There is another fascinating video coming soon that you absolutely will not want to miss.